Thank you. My name is, welcome to all of you. Good morning and good afternoon for those of you in the United States and in Europe. My name is Dr. James Buss. I am a senior managing scientist at Exponent, which is a global consulting firm in toxicology and risk assessment. I myself have a 40-year career in toxicology that spans activities in academia, nonprofit research industry, the pharmaceutical industry, the chemical industry, and the consulting industry. Today, I'm very pleased to invite all of us to participate in today's webinar entitled Glyphosate Reproductive Toxicology Toxicity Potential. The focus today, though, won't be on reproductive toxicity per se, but rather on embryo-fetal effects and the results of those studies and how they impact ultimately classification for reproductive and developmental toxicity. Today's presentation is the third in a series of 4 webinars. The first webinar was presented on November 8, and it addressed cancer effects in both animals and epidemiology in humans, of course. The second webinar was held on November 10, and it addressed the issues of genotoxicity and oxidative stress. Today's webinar, as I just mentioned, will address reproductive and developmental toxicity. And I should mention that there will be a 4th webinar, which you are all invited to attend on November the 28th, which will address specific target organ toxicity, reproductive exposure, and the impacts ultimately in the need for classification regarding that particular endpoint. I should mention that all of the webinars, including today's, are available on the Glyphosate Task Force website, which you can locate at www.glyphosate.eu. These webinars are all being recorded, so you will have the opportunity to re-review them if you visit that website. I should also mention that if you have questions after the close of the webinar, you can submit those questions to the Glyphosate website at www.glyphosate.eu. To turn then to today's presentation, we're very pleased to have Dr. Mark Martens as our presenter today. Dr. Martens is a consultant in preclinical development and toxicology. He was admitted to the European Register of Toxicology. Dr. Martens has held senior positions in industry at Johnson & Johnson and Monsanto, and has also held a position at the Scientific Institute of Public Health in Brussels, where he engaged with several important institutions addressing toxicology and risk assessment, including OECD, IPCS, IARC, and ECOTOX. Dr. Martens holds his PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Ghent, where he specialized in part in toxicology, and over his career, he has authored numerous publications and book chapters. So with that as an introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Mark, for the presentation for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, for the nice introduction. Good morning to the colleagues in the United States, and good afternoon to those attending in Europe. It is the intention of this seminar to take you on a walk through the data on the embryo-fetal development toxicity of glyphosate, to discuss the results and come to a conclusion whether or not glyphosate should be regarded as toxic to prenatal development. So today we will be talking first about the studies, a very short introduction on the studies. There's a little bit more information on the studies in the backup slides, so if there are questions in that regard, I can return to the backup slides. Then we will have an analysis of the results in the rat, conclusion of the rat data, then analysis of the results in the rabbit, and we have a discussion and conclusions of the rabbit data, and we have a look at the complete database and see how far glyphosate should or should not be classified as toxic to reproduction. Let's first have a look at the data in the rats. Now, as to the studies we are considering in this presentation, only consideration is given to the results of embryo-fetal development toxicity studies that have been performed with technical glyphosate acid, with a concentration range between 95 and 97%. So no studies with the formulation will be regarded, nor will studies with AMPA be regarded. Results of embryo-fetal development toxicity studies are considered that are in compliance with internationally agreed test guidelines, the OECD test guideline 414, applicable at the time of conduct of the study and that are performed in accordance with good laboratory practices. Some less compliant studies that are considered by the reporting member state as supplementary are also used for toxicological evaluation, but are given less weight in the weight of evidence analysis. Now let's have a look at the data in the rats. So which studies have been considered for this exercise in the rats? So we have in total 6 studies, of which 2 studies are less in compliance with the current guidelines and with the good laboratory practices. The studies that are less in compliance are the Suresh study of 1991 and the Tasker study of 1980. The Tasker study has been conducted before the application of the good laboratory practices and before the application of the OECD test guidelines, but has been conducted in compliance with good scientific conduct. The Suresh study has been conducted later, but is not in compliance because only one dose level has been considered, a dose level of 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. All of the studies have a sufficient number of gravid animals per group, and all of the studies actually covered the period of organogenesis. In the Tasker et al. Study, also fetal development was covered during exposure. Now let's have a look at the several parameters of those developmental toxicity studies. In the first place, maternal toxicity. I only took 2 studies, and these are the studies of the best quality, the Moxon study and the Hata-Kenaka study. And there you see there are absolutely no major toxicological effects in both studies, with the exception of the Hata-Kenaka study, where at the high dose level, at 1,000 milligrams per kilogram body weight, a high incidence of loose stools have been observed, which is indicative of an upset of the gastrointestinal system of the rat. So not much maternal toxicity they detect up to dose levels of 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. Now let's have a look at the gestation parameters, and the most important gestation parameter is shown here. It is the mean % post-implantation loss. So we have the graphs, the histograms of all 6 studies, and the results are represented in dark blue bars, which represent the % mean, and the light blue bars represent the standard deviation. The orange arrows cover the dose levels at which maternal toxicity has been found. As you can see, that actually in none of these studies an effect on mean post-implantation loss has been detected. A thing which is classic for mean post-implantation loss is the extremely high variability of that endpoint. So it makes it not so easy to do an interpretation, but in this case, there is nothing to be worried about. What can we say about the fetal parameters? Like in this case, the mean number of live fetuses per liter or viable fetuses per liter. Here we have the results of the 6 studies. And there we see that there is an effect in the Tasker et al. Study. There is a decrease in viable fetuses, which is statistically significant at the dose level of 300 milligrams per kilogram, and one decrease that is statistically significant at 3,500 milligrams per kilogram. 3,500 milligrams per kilogram is a toxic dose level. So we have a lot of gastrointestinal setup in the animals, and there we can more or less, say that's in the presence of severe maternal toxicity. These type of effects have not been confirmed in any of all the other studies, even not in the Brooker study, where we have also a dose up to 3,500 milligrams per kilogram. It is important to remind you of the fact that the maximum dose, the limit dose, that is normally applied to embryo-fetal development toxicity studies is 3,000 milligrams per kilogram. So 3,500 is way above it, but the investigators went so high because of the extremely low toxicity of glyphosate. What can we say about mean fetal body weight as the second fetal parameter? Well, we have two studies of all the studies presented on this slide which show an effect. There is the Brooker et al. Study, at which we have a decrease in mean fetal body weight at 3,500 milligrams per kilogram, a toxic dose level, and we do have a decrease in mean fetal body weight in the Tasker study, and that is also at a dose level of 3,500 milligrams per kilogram. These reductions in mean fetal body weight more or less represent a retardation of development of the fetuses because of the toxicity and the bad health condition of the dams at that dose level. What can we say about the number of malformed fetuses in the rat? Excuse me. If we take all the studies in combination and we plot out against all the dose levels investigated, the number of litters with malformed fetuses and the number of malformed fetuses, we see that the only study where an increased, although not statistically significant, increased incidence has been found was in the Tasker study at a dose level of 3,500 milligrams per kilogram. But the effects that have been observed in the Tasker study are quite specific. One litter includes 6 fetuses with a malformation with a syndrome of bent tail, open eyelids, missing kidneys and ureters, and various skeletal defects, and 3 fetuses of another litter with dwarfism. This type of effects have also been seen in the historical controls of the same laboratory. This type of effect is completely isolated to the Tasker et al. Study. It needs to be said that this study has been conducted at a high dose level of 3,500 milligrams per kilogram, which is way above the limit dose normally used for embryo-fetal toxicity studies. Now, I've got here a slide on the cardiovascular malformations in the rats, not because we detected significant effects on cardiovascular malformations, but because we detected those in the rabbit, which we will discuss a little bit later on, just to see whether those type of effects have not been prominently found in the rats. And as you can see, when all the studies have been plotted out, the results have been plotted out against the total dose range investigated, we see nowhere typical dose-related increase of these type of effects in the rats. The type of effects, and here and there you see cardiovascular malformation as the normal historical background. These are interventricular septal defect, retro-esophageal right-sided aortic arch, and right aortic arch. All these incidents or normal incidents that you can find in any of the embryo-fetal toxicity studies and have no bearing on the results of these studies. So, what can we say about all the rat studies? The conclusions. In the first place, no observed adverse effect level for maternal toxicity in the rat is 300 milligrams per kilogram per day, and that is based on the incidence increase of loose stools at 1,000 milligrams per kilogram per day in the Hatakinaka study. The no observed adverse effect level for embryo-fetal development toxicity in the rat is 1,000 milligrams per kilogram per day, and that is based on a reduced mean fetal body weight at 3,500 milligrams per day that has been detected in the Brooker et al. And in the Tasker et al. Studies. So overall, the rat development toxicity studies don't show any evidence of cardiovascular or other types of malformations as a result of glyphosate acid exposure via the oral route at doses up to 3,500 milligrams per kilogram per day. at that high dose level of 3,500, we've seen a reduction in fetal weight, but that is a direct effect of the toxicity of glyphosate in the dam at that dose level. And these are the conclusions of the rat studies. This is relatively short, but the most attention will go to the interpretation of the rabbit studies, where a number of issues have been identified and needed some more attention. Excuse me. So let's have a look at the rabbit studies. Which studies are now considered for this exercise? These are all regulatory studies. And of these studies, and we've got a total of 7 studies here. Of these studies, the Bide and Patil study carried out in 1989 have not been considered in this evaluation because there have been serious reporting deficiencies. For example, no individual data were reported, no statistical analysis, no uterine weights, and no maternal necropsy results. If the lack of these study results, it is impossible to make a full evaluation and to compare the results against those of the other studies. So this study was not regarded. The study which was regarded but is not fully compliant is the Tasker-et-al. Study, which has been conducted according to good scientific practices, but at a time frame before the application of good laboratory practices and the OECD test guidelines on embryo-fetal toxicity. So the other studies are worthwhile looking at and investigating. The number of gravid animals per group are actually varying from 15 to 20. Whereas actually the ideal number should have been 20 gravid animals per group. The duration of treatment was in the organogenesis period of the rabbit, with the exception of the Tasker-et-al. Study, where also the fetal development period was covered at the same time. So these were the studies. Now the first parameter to look like is where are we with the toxicity to the dams. And in the first place, mortality. In a lot of these studies, we've seen an increased mortality. As is prescribed by the OECD test guideline 414, no embryo-fetal results should be evaluated at those levels which produce a mortality of more than 10%. We see here, when we got a plot against the all the doses considered in all those rabbit studies, we see that for the Suresh study, already at 100 milligrams per kilogram, we have a mortality of 25%, which increases to a mortality of half of the animals at 500 milligrams per kilogram. Also, in the Tasker-et-al. Study, we see that from a dose level of 175 milligrams per kilogram and up to 350, we also see a dose-related increase in mortality. Now, the mortality can consist of either spontaneous death or animals to be killed because of their moribund condition or after abortion. So we have here a number of studies with too high mortality for a good embryo-fetal development evaluation. Nevertheless, we're going to look at all these in detail. Now let's have a look at clinical signs. And one of the most important clinical signs in these rabbits are the loose stools, the diarrhea, few or no feces. The rabbit is very intolerant to glyphosate in terms of gastrointestinal tolerance. So with high amounts of unabsorbed glyphosate in the gastrointestinal tract, the rabbits actually start suffering from loose stools, diarrhea, few or no feces, whereby the rabbits have no occasion at night to consume the soft pellets, which are extremely important for survival and for the maintenance of the progeny. So if we look at the different studies, in the Moxon study, we have already a quite high incidence of loose stools, and that is increasing in incidence from 100 milligrams per kilogram on, with a 100% incidence of diarrhea at 300 milligrams per kilogram. In the Hojo study, we got a quarter of all the animals or suffering of diarrhea at 300 milligrams per kilogram, and in the Suresh study, at a high dose of 500 milligrams per kilogram, 80% of the animals suffered from diarrhea. So at most dose levels, those animals had very severe gastrointestinal disturbances. Now let's have a look at the same parameters as we discussed with the rats. The first one, an important gestation parameter, the mean percent post-implantation loss. As we look at the 6 studies in combination, we see that in the Coles and Doleman study, there has been a statistically significant increase in the mid-dose at 200 milligrams per kilogram, which is a toxic dose, but not anymore again at a dose which is double of the mid-dose, 400 milligrams per kilogram. Please take note of the extremely large standard deviations because we are talking about a parameter with a high variation. The study that needs a little bit more attention in this case is the Brooker et al. Study, where we found a statistically significant increase of percent mean post-implantation loss over all dose levels. And then we will discuss this later. This effect has not been repeated in any of the other studies. What can we say about the fetal parameters? As you can see, in any of those studies, an effect on number of viable fetuses per liter has been detected, even at toxic doses up to 500 milligrams per kilogram. Mean fetal body weight. If we look at all the studies in combination, we can pick out the Moxon study and the Suresh study, where effects have been detected. In the Moxon study, we have a statistically significant decrease in mean fetal body weight at the high dose level, which is a toxic dose level, with a lot of gastrointestinal upset in the rabbit. In the Suresh study, this is quite of an unusual result, because here we have an increase in mean fetal body weight in the mid and the low dose, which actually don't have a lot of pathological significance. Now let's have a look at all the studies individually and where we are with the total number of malformations. So total number of fetuses and between brackets the number of litters, and I also indicated here the number of fetuses examined. For this type of study, when we look at the combined external, visceral, and skeletal malformations, there is no effect whatsoever in terms of treatment-related effect. As far as the external, visceral, and skeletal variations are concerned, we don't see any effect at all. So, from a total malformation point of view, the Coles and Doleman study in the rabbit is totally negative despite of the maternal toxicity. The next study, the Moxon study. By the way, in terms of documentation, in terms of reporting, this is the best study of all the studies that we had at our disposition. And there we can have more detailed type of tables so that we can more differentiate between the several different types of malformations. And I just want to draw your attention to the minor skeletal malformations. So what do we understand by minor skeletal malformations? These are the reduced ossification of transfer processes of cervical and lumbar vertebrae, sternebrae, and bones of the hindpaw. And there we see a statistically significant increase at 100 milligrams per kilogram and one at 300 milligrams per kilogram. What we can say about this is there is no dose-effect relationship, and the incidence at 300 milligrams per kilogram is even lower than the one that we see at 100 milligrams per kilogram. Nevertheless, we are going to look at this in a little bit more detail to try to understand what it means. When we look at skeletal variations, we only see at the high dose, which is a dose causing gastrointestinal upset in the rabbit, we see a statistically significant increase of variations. Now, if people are curious to know what variations it concerns, this is partially ossified odontoids and 27 presacral vertebrae. Now, let's have a further look into the minor skeletal malformations. I'll look into detail of these further down. Now, as the next study is the total number of malformations of the Hojo study. These are, and of all the malformations reported, external, visceral, skeletal, and visceral and skeletal variations, we only can pick up an increase, although not statistically significant, of the skeletal malformations at the 10, 100, and 300 milligrams per kilogram, although not very much dose effect related, but a higher incidence than when compared to the controls. When we look at the skeletal variations, we don't really see a dose effect relationship, only a statistically significant increase at 100 milligrams per kilogram, although at a high dose level, which is 3 times as high as the mid-dose level, we see an incidence which is even lower than the controls. Now, as the skeletal malformations are concerned, it would be worthwhile to have a closer look at those and to see in how far those skeletal malformations really represent a dose-related effect. And I'll show you that on the next slide. Yeah, this is the right one. So I'm not going to, to list all these different skeletal malformations, but these are the ones that in combination gave those relatively higher, although not statistically significant incidences at all the dose levels. But when we just pull them apart in the individual skeletal malformations, we do see that there is absolutely no dose-effect relationship and no, concern in terms of embryo-fetal toxicity. The Suresh study, which is the less compliant study because it's an underreported study, when we look at the external malformations, visceral and skeletal malformations, and then external visceral and skeletal variations, the only result that merits further attention is an increased incidence of visceral malformations at 500 milligrams per kilogram. And why is that so? That is because of an increased incidence of cardiovascular malformations that we are going to consider in more detail. The last study, the Brooker et al. Study that we look at here, has the same type of effect, although not statistically significant. So we got an increase of the incidence at 150 and 450 milligrams per kilogram of the external, visceral, and skeletal malformations in combination. So, and we need to look at this more in detail to understand whether there is a reason for concern or not. The Tasker study, the study which is not in compliance with good laboratory practices and for which we had too few fetuses left at the 350 milligrams per kilogram dose to do a fully compliant analysis of embryo-fetal development. And here in this study, we don't see any effect of glyphosate on external and visceral malformations and skeletal malformations. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the cardiovascular malformations. Total number of fetuses, and between brackets, liters with malformations. In this table, I presented all the studies and then plotted against all the dose levels that have been tested in all those studies in combination. And what merits more attention are indeed the Suresh and the Brooker study, where we found that there was indeed an increase in incidence of visceral malformations in the tables that I presented before. So for the Suresh study, we have an increased incidence at all those levels of cardiovascular malformations, and in the Brooker et al. Study, we have an increased incidence at 150 and 450 milligrams per kilogram. These type of effects have not been confirmed in any of all the other studies. So let's have a closer look at the Suresh study. It's a very specific study because it has been very badly reported, incompletely reported. There was also some kind of a mess up of rabbit numbers in the final report. Anyway, if you look at the cardiovascular malformations individually, that all of them compose the incidence of cardiovascular malformations, then we have a seal-shaped heart, cardiomegaly and combined with seal-shaped heart, dilated heart, and dilated ventricles, the right and the left. When we look at the dilated heart, that is the only cardiovascular endpoint for which we have a significantly, statistically significant increase when compared to control. When we have a closer look at the Brooker study, where we then also separated out all the endpoints in cardiovascular malformations, which are the right-sided ascending aorta, narrow dilated aortic arch pulmonary trunk, arterial trunk, dorsally displaced pulmonary trunk, retro-esophageal right subclavian artery, single carotid artery, interventricular septal defect, and enlarged left and reduced right ventricles. There we see that the interventricular septal effect, although not statistically significant, has a higher incidence at a high dose level. We also see a higher incidence at the mid-dose and the high dose for the retro-esophageal right subclavian artery. And we also see an increased incidence of the narrow dilated aortic arch pulmonary trunk arterial trunk. The several effects mentioned here, like the enlarged left, reduced right ventricles, the interventricular septal defect, and the narrow dilated aortic arch and pulmonary trunk, these are all part of a result of the same morphogenic mechanism. When we look at the results in the Brooker study, but not as the number of fetuses with malformations, but on a percent incidence basis, fetal basis, so that we can compare them against the percent incidence of the historical control range of 48 vehicle studies performed from January 1989 until October 1993 by the breeder who actually delivered the rabbits to the laboratory that conducted the test of Brooker et al. When we look at the narrow dilated aortic arch pulmonary trunk, we have an incidence at a high dose of 3.2%, which is higher than any of the two historical control ranges mentioned in the last column. But we will have to say that the 3.2% covers a combined incidence as well narrow aortic arch, as dilated aortic arch, as narrow pulmonary trunk and dilated pulmonary trunk, narrow arterial trunk, and the dilated arterial trunk. So that means that if we look at the historical control range where we combine both endpoints or more of these endpoints, we probably are still within the historical control range for the combination of these effects. When we look at the retro-esophageal right subclavian artery, we see an increased incidence at 150 and at 450, which both of them are higher than the maximum of the historical control range of those 48 vehicle studies. But we need actually to closely look at how we should interpret these percentages. When we look at the 2.7%, in fact, it means 3 fetuses with that malformation over a total of 112 fetuses. And when we look into the whole database of the historical controls, well, actually the background maximum incidence is 2 fetuses over the same bracket of fetuses. Sorry. That means that we have got only 1 fetus difference, which is a very minor difference in absolute terms. The same we can say about, for example, another important endpoint, interventricular septal defect, where we have a percentage of 4.2% at 450 milligrams per kilogram, which is higher than the historical control range of 0 to 2.8%. When we start looking at the individual figures, the absolute figures, there we see that, for the high dose level, we find that 4 fetuses out of 95 total fetuses had that malformation, whereas that the maximum of the background incidence was 3 fetuses over 106 to 152 fetuses, which is about a similar bracket of total fetuses. So that's only 1 fetus in absolute terms difference, which is a minor increase above the historical background. So it's not in any case very dramatic. Okay, let's have a discussion of the results in the rabbit. Maternal toxicity. So we do have a high preterm mortality, which is composed of spontaneous death and sacrifice because of moribund state or abortions in the mid and the high dose groups of 2 studies, the Suresh study and the Tasker study. The fact that we have such a high mortality invalidates the embryo-fetal development toxicity evaluation at these dose levels. Mortality was due to malgavage, to regurgitation of gastric contents, and to gastrointestinal intolerance to glyphosate acid. This was confirmed by necropsy, where we found lesions in the lungs, lesions in the trachea, and several changes in the gastrointestinal tract. The gastrointestinal effects, which were observed in practically all the studies, consisted of soft stools, diarrhea, few to no feces, stasis of the gastrointestinal motility, which has been indicated by the presence of hairballs. The rabbits regularly groom themselves and they swallow hairs, and normally with a normal gastrointestinal motility, those hairs are transited throughout the gastrointestinal tract. When there is an absolute stasis of the motility, those hairs start accumulating in the stomach and form hairballs. We saw gastroenteritis, watery fluid, and gas accumulation in cecum and rectum. These gastrointestinal effects led to a decrease in food consumption and body weight, and also a lack of maintenance of the progeny. The gastrointestinal effects disturbed or even interrupted the night and day physiological cycle of the gastrointestinal tract of the rabbit, whereby the animals were not anymore capable in consuming their soft fecal pellets at night. Soft fecal pellets are an important source of nutrients for the pregnant rabbit and for the maintenance of gestation. Let's analyze post-implantation loss. We found a statistically significant increase in percent post-implantation loss at all dose levels, although we found the dose-effect relationship in only one study, that was the Brooker et al. Study. The post-implantation loss at the low dose and at the high dose were slightly beyond the historical control range of 3.6 to 17.5%. However, the late embryonic deaths were also increased with those, but remained within the historical control range, whereas that there was no dose-effect relationship for early embryonic death. The percent implantation loss in the control group, 5.7%, was at the low end of the historical control range, 3.6 to 17.5%. During the makeup of the RAR document, another set of vehicle controls was discussed with a slightly higher, lower percentage of the historical control range, which was higher than the 5.7%, but with the expansion of that vehicle control data set, the lower range actually decreased, the lower level decreased to 3.6%. Nevertheless, the percent implantations in control group was at the low end of the historical control range, and if, for example, in another study, it would have been, the mid percentage of the historical control range of those of the percent implantation loss, then in such a case, we would have had no statistically significant difference in comparison with the controls. The result is not consistent with the outcome of all other studies where no effect whatsoever on post-implantation loss was observed. Fetal parameters. No effect was noted on the mean number of fetuses per liter in all studies. A statistically significant decrease was observed in mean fetal body weight in the high dose group in one study, that was the Moxon study. A statistically significant increase was observed in mean fetal body weight in the low and mid dose groups without a dose-effect relationship in one study. This effect has got very low pathological meaning in terms of fetal development. The decrease in mean fetal body weight at a high dose in the Moxon study is an effect of the retardation of fetal development due to the bad health condition of the dams at that dose level. They suffered from a decrease in food consumption, decrease in body weight, diarrhea, and gastrointestinal issues. Let's have a discussion about the malformations and variations that we saw in the lab. In the Moxon study, a statistically significant increase in skeletal variations was observed in the high dose group. This effect can be ascribed to the bad health condition of the dams at that dose, 300 milligrams per kilogram per day. There were no substance-related effects on major and minor malformations. An increase in skeletal variations can be the direct result of the bad health condition of the dams. In the Suresh study, a statistically significant increase was observed in visceral malformations in the high dose group, 500 milligrams per kilogram per day, which is primarily due to an increased incidence of cardiovascular malformations. In the Hojo study, A statistically significant increase in skeletal variations was noted in the mid-dose group, but without a dose-effect relationship. In the same study, a non-statistically significant increase of skeletal malformations was observed at all dose levels, but without a dose relationship. In the Doleman study, no substance-related effects on malformations and variations were observed. In the Brooker et al. Study, a non-statistically significant increase in malformations was observed in the mid and a high dose group. This increase is mainly due to the increase of cardiovascular malformations. In the Tasker study, a non-statistically significant increase was observed in external and visceral malformations in the high dose group. There was no dose-related effect on skeletal malformations. Now let's zoom in into the interpretation of the cardiovascular malformations, which is the main point to be considered for the rabbit studies, so that we understand whether or not there should have an impact on the classification of viruses. Very important to remark is that the increase of cardiovascular malformations in the Suresh study is due to dilated hearts, which was statistically significantly increased at all dose levels and without a dose-effect relationship, and was only observed in a limited number of liters per dose, 2 to 3. No dose-effect relationship was found for the other cardiovascular malformations in this study, like the seal-shaped heart, cardiomegaly, and dilated ventricles. Now, dilated ventricles may occur if the rabbits are killed by methods that produce anoxia in the fetuses. This is quite difficult to check because of the bad reporting of the study. The statistically significant increase in the incidence of dilated heart in the Suresh study is difficult to interpret, since this is an unusual term and was not defined in the study reports, and no criteria and measurements were given to allow comparison with the other studies. These cardiovascular effects have not been observed in the other studies, as the effects seen in this study are not related to the cardiovascular malformations in the Brooker study. Now let's have a look at the cardiovascular malformations in the Brooker study. Those malformations occurred in the same animals and are related to a single morphogenetic mechanism, which is the displacement of the developing Aortico-pulmonary septum, which may adjust during the postnatal period. These mechanistically related findings often cluster together, and they include narrow or dilated aorta or pulmonary artery, the interventricular septal defects, and disproportionately sized right and left ventricles. These findings were also observed, and often in the same clusters, in historical control data provided by the laboratory. Now, a couple of pictures to allow you to understand better what this morphogenetic mechanism is about. If you look at the embryonic rabbit heart, at the beginning of the development of the septum. So this is more or less the arterial trunk of the embryonic heart, where there is already a tendency for closure of the interventricular walls. but then the arterial trunk is then subdivided by a septum in 2 equal parts, and that septum actually spirals down to the ventricles. And when spiraling down, at the end, when it reaches the ventricles, it also provides the membranous ventricular septum that separates the right and the left ventricle. So when there is a disturbance in the development of that spiraling membrane, then we will have problems like interventricular septum. So here you see on how the blood flow runs through those, those 2 different segments of the aortic trunk. The one is of the arterial trunk. The one is the aortic trunk. This is the aortic trunk, and this is the pulmonary trunk. So, and here you see on how it corresponds with the heart, a full-size heart. So the spiraling down of the septum more or less creates the morphology of the arterial, the pulmonary artery to cross over with the aorta. And here you have a cartoon of a heart with an abnormally, an abnormal interventricular septum, which has not been completely closed to the membranous part. And there you see that you will have a leakage of the oxygenated blood into the right ventricle. So, all the thoracic malformations observed in the Brooker study, only following malformations were increased with dose. So the narrow or dilated aortic arch of pulmonary trunk with an incidence of 3.2% at a high dose. The retro-esophageal right subclavian artery, 2.7% at the mid dose and 2.1% at the high dose. And this is beyond the historical control range of 0 to 1.8%. The interventricular septal defect, 4.2% at the high dose, which is beyond the historical control range of 0 to 2.8%. The enlarged left reduced right ventricle, 2.1% at a high dose, which is also beyond the historical control range, if expressed in percent. If you look at the fetuses individually over the total number of fetuses examined at those dose ranges, you only come to a maximum difference of 1 fetus. Okay, let's have a look at the retro-esophageal right subclavian artery. Let's have a look at the normal picture at the right-hand side. And there you see here the ascending aorta and the descending aorta. And at the ascending aorta, you will have the brachiocranial trunk, which then subdivides into the right subclavian artery and the carotid artery. So that is here combined. For the left-hand side, actually the 2 arteries emerge separately from the descending aortic arch. So what happens with a retro-esophageal right subclavian artery, so that is the artery which normally should be positioned here, that artery actually emerges as a 3rd artery, leaving the descending arch of the aorta, and in order to join the right arm, it actually turns around the esophagus. This is an anomaly which by certain authors has not been considered as a malformation because it's not lethal. So at about 2% of the human population of such a subclavian artery. Of course, the morphogenetic origin of this anomaly is very different from the one of interventricular septal defect. I'm waiting for the next slide. Okay, here we go. So let's have a further discussion on this. So although the incidence in a percent fetal basis of these malformations were beyond the historical control range, there was only a very small difference in absolute terms. For example, in the high dose group, ventricular septum defects were observed in 4 fetuses in 4 liters, whereas the maximum number of fetuses with this type of defect per control group in the historical controls was 3. The retro-esophageal right subclavian artery is a malformation that is not related to the morphogenetic mechanism involving the formation of the spiral septum and is not uncommon. In men, this condition is found at an incidence of 0.5 to 2% of subjects. It's also not lethal. There is an inconsistent pattern of the most commonly occurring cardiac defects without a clear dose-related effect. The increased incidence with dose in cardiovascular malformations, as observed in the Brooker et al. Study, was not confirmed in any of all the other studies. And it also includes the Suresh study, where not such malformations was detected. The malformation there of the heart was dilated heart, which is ill-defined. So, what can we say about overall conclusions? There is no relationship between the cardiovascular malformations noted in the Suresh study, dilated heart, and those observed in the Brooker study. So they should look at as individual different malformations. And these effects were not confirmed in any of the other rabbit studies. So there is no consistency of the detection of this type of effect, and there is a problem with dose-effect relationship. The adverse developmental effects in the rabbit, like the increased post-implantation loss in one study, which was not confirmed in the other studies, and the reduction of fetal weight in another study, the Moxon study, which has been, which can be put into relation with the bad health condition of the rabbits, and the cardiovascular malformations only occurs to those levels with severe maternal toxicity. Just 2 more slides. So what can we say in terms of classification of the globally harmonized system? Now, this system provides 2 categories, Category 1 and Category 2, of which Category 1 is subdivided in A and B. A being a known human reproductive toxicant, so that there is sufficient evidence in epidemiology studies that there is a causal relationship between exposure to a chemical and the embryo-fetal developmental effects. It's very rare. It's very difficult to determine such type of effects. Category 1B is presumed human reproductive toxicant, largely based on data from animal studies. So there should be clear evidence of an adverse effect on development in the absence of other toxic effects, or the adverse effect on reproduction is considered not to be secondary to non-specific consequence of other toxic effects. Category 2 is actually some evidence for humans or experimental animals, possibly supplemented with other information of an adverse effect on development. And the evidence is not sufficiently convincing to place the substance in Category 1. And then again, the same as for Category 1B, the adverse effect on reproduction is considered not to be a secondary, non-specific consequence of the other toxic effects. So, and how can we consider the database results of glyphosate in terms of these criteria? There are no effects on embryo-fetal development that have been observed in the rat. And we're talking about 6 studies, of which 4 are full GLP and test guideline compliant. The delayed ossification and the reduced fetal body weight that we've seen in the rabbits of the Moxon study at the high dose level are clearly the consequence of the severe maternal toxicity at the high dose. It's getting slower this time. The increased post-implantation loss, Brooker et al., and the cardiovascular malformations dilated heart in the Suresh study and interventricular septum defects in the Brooker et al. Study are not related, have not been confirmed in the other studies, and only occurred in the presence of severe maternal toxicity. So if you apply the weight of evidence analysis based on the results of all rats and rabbit studies, that indicates that glyphosate does not produce embryo-fetal development toxicity, and therefore it should not be classified as toxic to reproduction. This is about my presentation. If there are any questions, you would be welcome to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. This is Jim Buss again, the moderator. Mark, I want to thank you for a very clear and robust presentation. I think it was easily followed by all of the attendees, so I thank you again for the clarity of your presentation. One question that I would have for you is, since the primary cardiovascular defect in rabbits was observed really only in one study of real concern, how confident are we that the other high-quality studies, such as Moxon, for instance, would have been able to detect for instance, the subclavian artery displacement in the study that was conducted by Moxon?
Well, the Moxon study is actually the study that has the highest quality in terms of reporting, observations, and a number of parameters studied. If indeed, the effects that we've seen in the Brooker study are real effects, then we should have seen them in the Moxon study. And we didn't see any dose-related effects of cardiovascular malformation in the Moxon study. But perhaps there is a slide we can look at, and that is the slide on the overview of cardiovascular malformations over all the studies. And if you look at and I'm looking now at the number of slides, the number of the slides we need to look at. And for example, if you look at the slide number 21, and I'm going to try and share the system. I hope it works. Okay, here we have slide 21. You will see that for external visceral minor and external visceral major malformations, we see that in Moxon study there is absolutely no dose-related effect. And that includes automatically also the cardiovascular effect. So,
thank you, Mark.
I hope this very satisfactory.
Another question for you, Mark, relative to the potential health implications if, in fact, the cardiovascular subclavian artery lesion seen in the Brooker study was real. The incidence was clearly very low, and you pointed out that humans actually have a background incidence of about 0.5 to 2% of that very same type of malformation in humans. What do we know about the potential functional consequences of that malformation when it occurs in humans at the background level?
There are no functional consequences, so it's not an adverse effect. It's actually more to be considered as a variation rather than a malformation. Some authors actually cite it as a variation. So it has no consequences whatsoever on the functioning of the cardiovascular system. Only when you get under surgery, then the surgeons will have to look out for this.
So this is clearly not one of those malformations that as the individual would age, that they might encounter risks for increased sudden death as they engage in athletic activities or other types of things as they age over time.
No, not at all. And it's certainly not comparable in that regard to the interventricular septal defects.
Correct. Thank you for that clarification. I think that's a very important note to make. I'm looking at my board to see whether any other questions. If we had one other question come in regarding the total number of studies that were examined, but I think you really took us through a very nice roadmap with respect to the number of studies that were examined, both in rats and in rabbits, and the particular differences between the studies and how they relate to the ultimate final interpretation. And I think it was very important to note, as you did, that obviously there was a lack of consistency in the types of malformations and variations that were seen across studies, some studies showing no effects whatsoever, or others that do show effects weren't replicated in other studies that also showed similar type of target organ effects. So I think you took us through a very nice roadmap in terms of how there was inconsistencies and contradictions across studies. So I think that really helped the presentation a lot, Mark. Thank you. Let's see if I see any further questions coming in, and I don't see any others. So what I would point out to the audience, rather than to keep us here waiting for questions, I should note to those of you participating in as webinar audience members, if a question certainly occurs to you after the close of the session, we certainly encourage you to submit them to the website at www.glyphosate.eu. You will see the connection there within that website to the webinar series, so please submit your questions there. And the individual presenters, such as Mark, would be delighted to respond to your question in writing if it's submitted again to the webinar. So in terms of closing this webinar today, I want to certainly thank you, Dr. Martens, for your superb presentation and the clarity of it and the detail of it. I think it helps everybody understand the overall picture of developmental and reproductive effects associated with glyphosate, and most importantly, how those data sets fit into the ultimate classification of glyphosate as a developmental toxicant under the existing EU classification system. Again, I want to remind all the webinar participants that there will be one additional webinar to be presented on November the 28th. Again, that will be presented, I believe, by Dr. Martens again, who will address the specific target organ toxicity, repeated exposure endpoint and the impact of that on the ultimate classification within the EU system. That will be at the same time as the webinar held today. And again, I would remind all of the webinar participants that these webinars are being recorded and again are available for reviewing on the glyphosate website at www.glyphosate.eu. So with those closing remarks, again, I want to thank the organizers for pulling this webinar together, and I believe we will close the session now. So thank you again, Dr. Martens, and to the audience participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim.